I feel like when I get up to lecture in my classroom now, I should be expecting music to usher me on and off. So I was invited to come here and speak today on lessons from behavioral economics for public pension plans. I've been doing research for the past 2 decades on how to improve savings outcomes. A lot of that has been with private sector plans because that's where most of the data is and the people who are willing to collaborate with academic researchers. And I realize that public plans have some similarity to private sector plans, but also there are a lot of important differences. Nonetheless, I think there are a lot of lessons that transfer over, and some of them that may even be more important in a public sector context. So I thought I would start out by addressing the question that some of you might have, which is, what is behavioral economics? So when I teach my classes at Harvard, this is the definition I use. I'm going to give you a more intuitive explanation, but for those of you who like dictionary definitions, this is not from a dictionary, this is my definition. Behavioral economics incorporates insights from economics and other behaviorally oriented disciplines, including psychology, sociology, anthropology, and cognitive neuroscience, to enrich standard economic models in ways that improve our ability to understand and predict human behavior, market outcomes, and public policy. So the basic idea is that if you want to design a retirement system that works well for the people for whom you're designing the system, you have to understand how they are going to behave within that system, because their behavior is going to determine whether the system succeeds or whether the system fails. And so behavioral economics is an approach to say we have a system, in this case a retirement system, that's trying to help prepare public sector employees for retirement, and how can we make that system work well for them, and that requires understanding how they're going to behave and interact with the system. Okay, here might be a more intuitive way to think about what behavioral economics is. So traditional economic models assume that actors in those models are all like Mr. Spock. We're rational, we're unemotional, and we make decisions by calculating the costs and the benefits and picking the right outcome and then doing it. And behavioral economics says, there may be some people out there that are like Mr. Spock, but there are a lot more of us out there that are kind of like Homer Simpson. And the Homer Simpsons of the world have a lot of good intentions, like I'm going to stick to my diet, but then when we walk by an open box of donuts, our good intentions fall by the wayside. So the basic idea is, if we want to make a system that works well for everyone, we've got to have a system that works not just for Mr. Spock, we have to have a system that works for Homer Simpson as well. So what are the issues that make good retirement outcomes difficult for people like Homer Simpson? Because Mr. Spock doesn't really need our help. He could figure it out on his own. It's Homer Simpson that needs our help. Okay, so we're going to start off with a couple of easy tasks just to get you thinking about how does behavioral economics help us think about things differently. So easy question. I realize it's first thing in the morning, so we're going to start with an easy question. Which horizontal line is longer, the top line or the bottom line? Just shout it out. The top line. Okay, that hopefully was easy, didn't require a lot of cognitive effort. Okay, now I'm going to make it slightly more complicated, and this will be familiar to some of you. Now, which line is longer? Now, some of you know the answer, so maybe we should say which line looks longer. The bottom line looks longer, okay? But in fact, this is an optical illusion, and if we take away all the diagonal lines, we can see that the two lines are exactly the same length. I know this because I copied and pasted one to make the other. They're exactly the same length. So what is it that makes the bottom line look longer than the top line, even though they are exactly the same length? And the answer is, we've got a lot of ancillary information going on in this picture. In particular, we've got a bunch of diagonal lines, and those diagonal lines distort our perception of these two horizontal lines. So the lesson from this slide is, when people are making decisions, Mr. Spock can disregard all of those diagonal lines, but Homer Simpson has a really hard time with that. So there's a lot of other stuff going on in the world around us that makes it difficult for the Homer Simpsons in the world to figure out the right answer to questions like, which line is longer? Okay, here's another task. In just a minute, I'm gonna click and there's gonna be a list of words that are gonna show up on the screen. And I want you to, out loud, don't be ashamed and embarrassed here, out loud, read the words from top to bottom, calling out the color that each word is printed in. Okay, they're not all gonna be aligned horizontally, but just go from the top to the bottom, okay? Easy task, call out the color of each word. Okay, so that was an easy task again, another easy task, okay? You guys have been reading for years, you did a great job. You know, your first grade teacher would be proud. Okay, now we're gonna do the same task, but I've changed it just a little bit. So the task is the same, list of words, tell me the color that the word is printed in, okay? Okay, so the lesson I want you to take away from this is I took a task that is very easy and I made it difficult, okay? And you had to think about it and some of you messed up on it, okay? So the lesson I want you to take away from this is that you can make life easier for the people you're trying to help and you can make life more difficult for the people you're trying to help. And if you want them to read the list of words correctly, it helps to print the color of the word in the same color as the word. So we're going to talk about some more practical applications, but another kind of easy way to get your head around what is behavioral economics. Behavioral economics says when you print black in the color pink, people are going to get confused. Okay, so there's a theory in the literature on the neurology of the brain and decision making. It's called the multiple systems hypothesis. And the idea is that we have different systems in our brain that process information differently and are useful in different contexts. And one system, which they go by lots of different names, one of the more popular ones is System 1 versus System 2. That's not a very well-informed nomenclature because it doesn't help you keep things straight, so I wouldn't recommend it, but this is what's stuck. System 1 is the Homer Simpson system. It's affective, it's fast, it's reflexive, it's effortless, it's impulsive, it's myopic, it's what lets you get things done in the snap of the fingers. The second system is the Mr. Spock system. It's analytic, it's slow, it's reflective, it's effortful, it's deliberative, it's patient. Now, both of these systems are useful. If there was a lion in the corner of the room up here, which system do you want to be in charge? You want Homer Simpson to be in charge. You don't want to calculate, how fast can I run relative to the lion and the slowest person in the room. You just want to get out of here, okay? But if you want to figure out how to be financially prepared for retirement, you would like Mr. Spock to be in charge. And the problem is that sometimes we do a good job of invoking the right system for the right task, but sometimes the wrong person is in charge. Sometimes Homer Simpson ends up being in charge when Mr. Spock should be, and vice versa, right? So an example of that would be you go out to dinner with a friend who can't figure out what to order on the restaurant menu. That's a person who's let Mr. Spock be too in charge of the task of figuring out exactly how to optimize what to eat for dinner. And then you've got the friends who rush into marriage in Las Vegas, and that's when Homer Simpson's in charge of a decision where maybe you'd like a little bit more of Mr. Spock, okay? So I'm going to talk about two particular challenges in the retirement savings domain that really get in the way of Homer Simpson's getting good outcomes for retirement. So the first one is the role of complexity. What happens when an environment is complicated and Homer Simpson is in charge? So being financially prepared for retirement is hard. So it's a complicated problem. There are lots of choices to make. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future, which makes the implications of those decisions difficult to forecast and understand. And there are limits to the extent to which you can learn from experience, because this is a task that, by and large, most of us only do once. So in contrast to learning how to drive, where you can make mistakes and correct, and eventually you become really good at this, this is not true of figuring out how to be prepared for retirement. Okay, these issues are compounded by the fact that many people are not particularly financially literate. And my experience is that this can be a difficult concept for people who are financially literate to understand. But figuring out how to plan optimally for retirement is hard for the experts. Even people who have PhDs and lots of professional designations have to spend a lot of time to come up with a retirement plan for themselves or someone else. So just think about trying to do that if you haven't had the training. You know, for me, I know how to think about these issues, but if you send me to the Toyota dealership to try and understand what's wrong with my car, I'm going to have a hard time because I'm not very car literate. And we don't expect people to be literate in every domain of their lives. This happens to be a domain where it would be helpful, but it's not true that everyone is a financial expert. So if it's hard for the experts, it's going to be even harder for the novices. And then the third reason that things are hard is because the Homer Simpsons of the world bring a lot of behavioral biases to the task of thinking about retirement. So one is present bias. We are just wired to place more weight on what's happening today than on what's happening in the future. And let's face it, unless you're a person in this room, thinking about retirement is not all that exciting. It is not what motivates you to get up in the morning. And Homer Simpson is going to be much more interested in the football game that's on TV, the donuts that are baking in the kitchen, things like that. Another behavioral bias is inattention. So we've got a world where lots of stuff is going on, and we cannot pay attention to all of the things that demand our attention, and some things fall by the wayside, particularly things that are not that exciting. And third, we use a lot of heuristic thinking. So when decisions are hard, we try and find ways to make them easier by applying heuristics, simplifying heuristics. And sometimes those heuristics serve us well, that's why we use them, but sometimes they get us into trouble. So when we have complicated, so in the public sector retirement space, what are some examples of decisions that might be complicated for the Homer Simpsons of the world? So I know in some of your jurisdictions, the first decision an employee would have to make is, do they want to be in the state-sponsored defined benefit plan, or the state-sponsored defined contribution plan, or the hybrid plan? That's a hard decision, okay? So that's one hard decision. Then if you decide you're going to go the defined contribution route, you got, a primary plan, or you got a bunch of different supplemental plans. So which, if any of those plans are you going to participate in? Are you going to participate on a pre-tax basis or on a Roth basis? How much are you going to contribute to these plans? What asset allocation are you going to choose? Okay, if you don't have a lot of financial expertise, these are really hard decisions. What happens when Homer Simpson faces hard decisions? When things are complicated, three things happen. One, individuals procrastinate. Okay, so if a decision is hard, you want to put it off. And the hope is maybe if I put it off, it will become easier. Maybe the retirement fairy will come knock on my door and tell me what to do. The retirement fairy hangs out with the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus, so not going to happen anytime soon. So people procrastinate, first thing. And in the extreme, if you procrastinate a lot, it's a complete failure to act. Second, as I mentioned earlier, people adopt simplifying heuristics that can cause mistakes. And third, they make mistakes, okay? So what's some evidence on this? So this is not a retirement problem. This is a diagram of an IRS 1040 tax return and all of the related forms and worksheets. You guys have all had to prepare taxes for yourselves, I'm assuming, or you pay someone else to do it because it's too complicated and you don't like it. So 2/3 to 3/4 of taxpayers actually are owed a refund every year from the IRS. The average refund is between $2,500 and $3,000. When do people file their taxes? Turns out they file their taxes at the last minute. So even though most of them have a refund, they procrastinate. Why? Because it's hard, because the IRS has not made filing your taxes easy. Okay, well, what happens when we make saving for retirement hard? So here's some data. This is from the data underlying this figure comes from Vanguard. And what it shows on the x-axis is the number of funds that are offered in a retirement plan. And these are all plans where there's only one plan to choose from. Okay, what's the number of funds in the plan? And the y-axis is what's the participation rate in that plan. And these are all plans without automatic enrollment. So these are plans where employees have to actively sign up. And what you can see is that as the number of asset allocation choices increases, their participation rate in the plan is decreasing. So if you run a regression and estimate things, you get that each additional 10 funds reduces the participation rate by about 2 percentage points. And this would be a story consistent with complexity. More choices makes this decision more complicated, and that leads to procrastination, fewer people in the plan. Now, this is data that is consistent with this story but doesn't necessarily prove it. This is from the NAGDCA Perspectives and Practice Survey report that was highlighted in the introductory remarks. And what this shows is that the participation rate of survey respondents where the plan is the only DC option is about 57%. And the participation rate when other plans are available is 40%. So this would be consistent with the idea that when you have more plans to choose from, you've got less participation. Okay, second impact of complexity is complexity leads to the use of simplifying heuristics. So people adopt rules to make decision tasks easier. So a really good example of these simplifying heuristics comes from how people make asset allocation choices. So if we have a lot of different investment options to choose from, what are some of the strategies that individuals use to try and make that decision easier? So one strategy is to focus on options that are easier to evaluate. So use your limited cognitive resources to think about things that are easy to think about rather than things that are hard to think about. Now, this would be a good strategy if something that's easier to evaluate is actually the better option, but that's not always necessarily the case. Okay, a second simplifying heuristic people use is to give more weight to things that are familiar. So if you've got a list of 50 investment options to choose from, focus on the ones that you have heard of before. So this leads people to do things like invest more money in local industries, invest more money in employer stock. That's not an issue in a public sector plan, but in private plans, we see people loading up on employer stock and investing less money in international investments because the international investments tend to be less familiar. These are all problems with diversification. So this focus on things that are familiar leads people to be misdiversified, put more weight on things that are close and familiar and less weight on things that might be delivering a higher return and uncorrelated with everything else in your portfolio, but you're ignoring it just because you haven't heard of it. Okay, third is status quo bias. Focus on the thing that is the default option. So in plans that have automatic enrollment, you see that the vast majority of assets go into whatever has been selected by the plan sponsor as the default option. In private companies, a lot of employers match in the form of employer stock, and you see that the money is extremely sticky. If it gets matched in employer stock, even if employees can reallocate, the money stays there. So the default option is really important. Focus on options that are at the beginning and the end of the list. So if you've got a long list, you look at the top and you look at the bottom. And then lastly, focus on the size of different categories as signals about how much you should invest. So if the investment menu includes a lot of high expense actively managed funds, you assume that if there are a lot of these in the choice set, that I should probably be spending more time looking at those because there are a lot of them there, and that might be exactly the wrong thing to do. So these are all examples of heuristics people use to make the decision easier when it's complicated, but many of these heuristics can lead you to an asset allocation that probably isn't best for the average participant and could be improved on. What do you do with this? Well, if the decision is hard, people are going to use heuristics to simplify it. The way you solve this problem is you make the decision context easier and better for people. You pick a sensible default, you have a smaller investment menu, things like that. Okay, the last implication of complexity is that people make mistakes. And what I'm going to do is show you some example of mistakes in other domains where decisions are complicated. So here's an example of a ballot in the 2003 California gubernatorial recall election. And this was the election that led to Arnold Schwarzenegger being elected governor. And there were almost 150 candidates running in that election. Because it was a recall election, there was no primary. There's just one big grand election. There were 150 candidates listed in a great big long list. And then in this particular jurisdiction, there was a punch card ballot. And you can see how tiny the print is on that ballot. And a study by one of my former colleagues found that with ballots like this, where it's kind of hard to figure out how to take your candidate from the list and figure out which hole to punch on that ballot, more than 0.5% of the votes were miscast. That is, people wanted to vote for candidate X, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and ended up mistakenly poking a hole that was close to that, but not exactly that. Now, you may ask, how can you figure that out? And I'll refer you to the paper if you want to know. So when you've got a complicated voting technology, you end up getting mistakes in who is being voted for. I'm not suggesting here that Arnold Schwarzenegger was a mistake. Didn't mean to imply that, but you may not end up voting who you think you're voting for. Okay, another example, mortgages. So mortgages are really complicated to figure out. And there's been research that shows that if you give people the task of choosing a mortgage when all of the mortgages don't have points, people do a better job. That is to say, they pick a mortgage that has lower fees associated with it than when you are looking at people who are choosing a mortgage and choosing among mortgage options that include mortgages that allow you to pay points up front to reduce the interest rate over the long run. And the explanation would be that this trade-off between paying points today and a lower interest rate is really complicated for people to figure out. When that's the choice domain they're dealing with, they do a worse job and they end up actually paying more for their mortgage. Another example from health insurance. So a really interesting study published in the last year or two looked at a large firm where employees had the choice between several dozen health insurance plans. And as it turns out, many of these plans were dominated by other plans. By dominated, I mean there was another plan in the menu that would deliver the exact same benefits but at a higher cost. So usually the way a plan was dominated was there was a low deductible and a high deductible version of the same plan, so a $500 versus a $1,000 deductible, but the price difference between the two plans was more than $500. So you could pay $700 to reduce your deductible by $500. That makes you worse off, okay? That's an inferior decision. It's dominated. And the study shows that the majority, not some, the majority of employees in this context picked a dominated plan because it was too hard for them to figure out which plan was the best option. Okay, so there are a lot of mistakes that people make when choices are complicated. How do you help people get to better outcomes? Well, the most straightforward way is to simplify the process. So I'm going to show you one really easy intervention to try and simplify a complicated process. I'm not throwing this out there as this is the be-all, end-all solution. I'm throwing this out there as this is the tip of the iceberg. Like, this was a low-cost, scalable way to try and make things a little bit easier, but this was by no means an attempt to completely overhaul the decision process to make the whole thing easier. And this was done many, many years ago with what was then Aon Hewitt. A little nod to Rob Austin and his colleagues that are here. Okay, so this was done with an organization that had a savings plan, did not have automatic enrollment. So if you wanted to be in the plan, you had to sign up. And this particular organization had pretty dismal participation rates despite having an employer match, and there was no DB pension on the side. So the 401k plan was it. And they decided to pilot a simplified enrollment process. So employees were given a little form to enroll in the savings plan. Check here, and you'll be enrolled at a 5% contribution rate invested in a diversified target retirement fund. So this is making the process simpler in a couple of ways. Number one, there's a pre-selected option. So a contribution rate and an asset allocation. And if you're okay with that, you can just check the box, yes, I'm okay with that. If you're not okay with that, you could go through all of the other channels to pick a different contribution rate, pick a different asset allocation. But this was an easy way for people to sign up for the plan without having to think deeply about the contribution rate they wanted or the asset allocation they wanted. Now, whether or not this approach makes sense or is good for your employees depends on what the default contribution rate and the default asset allocation is, but what I want to show you for today is just what does it do to enrollment? How does this impact procrastination? So this was the first two companies that rolled this out. The first one started distributing these easy forms at new employee orientation. So if you looked at newly hired employees at this orientation, before they started handing out this simplified enrollment form, in the first 4 months, 9% of them signed up for the savings plan. Okay, that's like an F. That's like a really low participation rate. After they started handing out these forms, it went up to 34%. Okay, now 34% is like a D in terms of overall participation. I'm not throwing any parties over 34%, but with a one-page sheet of paper making it easy, we got from 9% to 34%. A quadrupling of the participation rate from a simple intervention to make it easier. Second organization that tried this was mailed out to non-participating employees, went from 6% to 16% after 4 months. The first organization was so enthusiastic about what they got with new hires, they started rolling it out with all of their employees, and within 4 months, their participation went up by about 10 percentage points. Still low, even after the 10 percentage point increase, but big change in behavior over a really short period of time. The second company decided, they were encouraged by the success, they were going to start sending out this form to non-participating employees every year. So if you took non-participating employees and you tracked how many of them signed up for the plan over the next 2.5 to 3 years, you'd get that, after about 3 years, about 22% of them would have signed up. Once the company started sending out these forms, this is what it looks like. You can see exactly when the company is sending out the forms. You get about a 10 percentage point increase in savings plan participation, and 3 years out, you've taken 22% of those employees who weren't participating, and you've doubled that number to about 45%. So I draw two lessons from this. One is, simplifying the process can have a big impact, and two, simply going after people repeatedly can also have a bigger effect. So that would be consistent with a story of inattention. This form comes in the mail, it's a busy day, you don't go straight into the circular filing cabinet, otherwise known as the trash can, but next year when it comes, maybe you're paying attention to it. Okay, the second concept, so we've talked about complexity. The second concept I want to talk about is choice architecture. So what is choice architecture? Choice architecture is the design of the environment and context in which choices are made. So we're dealing with choice architecture every single day of our lives. And the retirement plans that you administer all have a choice architecture around them. But a lot of times that choice architecture was not designed with any sort of intentionality, and it can work against the outcomes that you want. So let me give you some examples. So let's start off with, we're going to do some learning by analogy. Choice architecture of a dual flush toilet. A little bit of potty humor here. So on the left here, we have the new flushing mechanism of toilets that were installed in the bathrooms in my office a couple of years ago. So these were designed to be, or these were billed as water-saving toilets that gave you the option of a big flush or a little flush. Okay, so so you can see there's a green handle. The green handle is supposed to remind you that this is like an environmentally friendly toilet. You've got a big flush and a little flush option, and you're supposed to flush up for a little flush, and you're supposed to flush down, press down for a big flush. Okay, so what's wrong with this choice architecture? So one problem is it's labeled here, what you're supposed to do, but in the actual restroom, it's not labeled particularly well. And by force of habit, which direction are most people going to flush? They're going to flush down. So if what you're trying to do is encourage people to conserve water, your design is working against you, because people's natural inclination is going to be to flush down, and the down flush here is the big flush. Okay, so you've made it easy for people to use more water, because using more water is what happens if you just continue to do what you were already doing. If you want to save water, you have to conscientiously think about, I got to flush differently. And I'm guessing that most of you, when you're in the restroom, that's not what you're thinking about, okay? Okay, now let's look at a more intuitive design, okay? This is a different flushing mechanism. So this is a button, one of kind of the modern, more European toilets with the buttons on top. And there's a half flush, and then there's a full flush. The half flush is using half a gallon per flush. The full flush is using closer to a whole gallon per flush. Why does this work better? So first of all, the little flush is in green. So if you only went for the green part, you'd get the little flush. And the little flush is the smaller button, and the big flush is the bigger button surrounding it. Okay, so this is an example. These are examples of choice architecture. They're both trying to accomplish the same thing, give people an option to choose between a little flush and a big flush. But the one on the right is more likely to lead to more people choosing the little flush than the one on the left. Okay, so choice architecture that doesn't work and that does work. Here's another example of choice architecture that everyone is familiar with. It turns out that when we are deciding how much to eat, we are very sensitive to the choice architecture around food. So what are some examples with this? Our decisions about what and how much to eat are impacted by the order in which we see food on a restaurant menu or in the lineup in the cafeteria. We eat more if the food is served in a large serving bowl. The size of the serving bowl we use as a cue for like how much of that food we should put on our plate. We eat more when the size of the plate onto which we are serving the food is bigger. So we eat more if we have a 10-inch dinner plate than if we have an 8-inch dinner plate. We eat more when there's a greater variety of food to choose from. So if you have a bowl of multicolored M&Ms, people will pick more M&Ms out of that bowl than if you have a similarly sized bowl with only a single color of M&Ms in it. We eat more depending on how the food is named. So we will eat more of the farm fresh beans than when we'll eat of just the plain old beans. So these are all subtle ways that how much we eat is impacted by the decision environment in which we are choosing how much to eat. So what are some of the elements of choice architecture, and then we'll talk about how they apply to savings plans. So one would be the number of options, the order of the options, the structure of the options, how the options are framed or presented, the process around making the choice. So is it on a paper form? Is it electronic? Is it in person? The timing of the choice. When are we making the choice? How often are we making the choice? These are all elements of choice architecture. So let's go back to one element of choice architecture I talked about earlier. And this would be in the jurisdictions that have it, when you have the choice between a DB plan, a DC plan, or a hybrid plan, or some subset of these three. So if you've got a context like this, every jurisdiction that I am aware of has a default option that is designated. It turns out what's designated as the default option, so that's an aspect of choice architecture, what's the default if you don't pick anything, has a huge sway on outcomes for participants. So here's data from 4 different states that all have plan choice, and the option that has the dark, thick border around it is the default option in that jurisdiction. And what you can see is that in Florida and Ohio and South Carolina, the DB plan is the default option, and the vast majority of people are in the DB plan. In Washington, the hybrid plan is the default option, and if you want to be in the DB plan, you have to do something different, and most people are in the hybrid plan. So the default option carries the day. Here's data from a plan that has what I call a differentiated default. So there's a DB and a DC plan, and you can pick between the two of them, but the default is different for employees that are younger than age 45. For younger employees, the default is the defined contribution plan, and for employees over 45, the default is the defined benefit plan. So in this chart here, we've got age on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we've got the fraction of people that are in the default plan. And what you can see is this huge discontinuity at age 45. So both of these lines are decreasing with age, suggesting that the defined contribution plan is preferred by younger employees, and the defined benefit plan is preferred by older employees. But you get this huge discontinuity at age 45 when the default option changed. And why? It's because most people aren't making an active choice, even though they have a choice. They're just sticking with the default option, and this dramatically impacts outcomes. Now, in some jurisdictions, there are a number of defined contribution plans to choose from. And in those contexts, employees can either choose to be in a DC plan or not in the plan, and of course, then they can choose which of the plans they want to be in. So in these contexts, whether you automatically enroll employees or whether they have to opt in has a huge impact on outcomes. So in the very first paper that I wrote on the impact of automatic enrollment, looked at a company that didn't have it and then went to having it. When you had to opt in, the participation was 37% of newly hired employees, and after automatic enrollment, it was between 75 and 95% for every single demographic subgroup you could look at. So you get this huge impact on participation. Now, in the private sector, that's led to legislative changes to encourage automatic enrollment in the U.S., which has led to the blue line, big increase in the fraction of plans using automatic enrollment. The red line, big increase in the fraction of plans that have more than 80% of employees in a plan. And the orange line, big increase in the participation rates for newly hired employees. If we look at public sector plans, this is once again from the NAGDCA Perspectives and Practice Survey. Only 20% of DC plans report using auto-enrollment. So the public sector is a little bit behind the private sector when it comes to using features like automatic enrollment. And I understand that there are barriers to doing that, but I view that as an opportunity rather than as an obstacle. The UK has made automatic enrollment the centerpiece of recently enacted pension reform that they've been rolling out over the last 5 years. To date, they've had an opt-out rate of only 9 to 10%. And an increase in overall savings plan participation of over 20 percentage points. The state of Oregon just rolled out their state Auto-IRA program, OregonSaves, in July. And in their initial pilot with a very small number of very small employers, they've had an opt-out rate of about 23%. So this is an element of choice architecture that can work very, very well. And if you're trying to create outcomes that are beneficial for participants, this is the one that gives you the most bang for the buck. Why does it work so well? First of all, because most people want to save. Secondly, as we noted, it's a complicated decision. And automatic enrollment takes this complicated decision and makes it easy. Namely, you don't have to do anything and you're saving for retirement. So it simultaneously tackles a number of the Homer Simpson biases. Tackles the complexity, tackles your tendency to procrastinate because you're in the plan if you procrastinate, tackles limited financial literacy because you don't have to think about whether or not this is a good idea, it's just done for you, and tackles the problem of limited attention. So this is kind of like the amazing super weapon in this context. Okay, let me talk about one other aspect of choice architecture. So if you were a Mr. Spock academic and you were predicting how much would people save for retirement, we would probably predict that if we took a bunch of data and plotted how much individuals decide to save for retirement, that we'd get a nice bell-shaped distribution. Okay, lots of things in the world have nice bell-shaped distributions. So there'd be some central number around which a lot of people would gravitate, but we'd see some dispersion on both sides. Well, when we look at how much people decide to save, we actually see that it looks nothing like this bell-shaped distribution at all, and what can we learn from that? So here's some data from a plan that originally did not offer a match, okay? And when it didn't offer a match, here's the distribution of contribution rates. So you can see, not bell-shaped distribution at all. And what I want you to see is that it's spiking at 5%, at 10%, and 15%. Okay? This is an example of a simplifying heuristic. I've got all these contribution rate options. I don't know which one to choose. The heuristic I use is, let me focus on numbers that are multiples of 5, because I know how to think about multiples of 5. I don't have to consider all the options. I only have to consider, 2 or 3 options. Okay, so this was the distribution of outcomes with no match. The plan went in then and offered a match of 25 cents up to 4% of pay. And after the match was implemented, this is now the distribution of contributions. So you can still see the multiples of 5, but now we see the vast majority of people are now at the 4% match threshold. So, another really important aspect of helping individuals be financially prepared for retirement is ensuring that they are saving enough. In many public sector plans, that would be saving enough on top of a DB plan, or saving enough on top of a DB plan and Social Security, although in some of your jurisdictions, the employees are not covered by Social Security. But the point I want you to take away from this is, number one, example of simplifying heuristics, but number two, the match threshold, if you have a match, is a really potent way to send a signal to employees about how much they should be saving for retirement. And you may not want to use it as that type of a signal, but it doesn't matter what you are trying to do with it. The employees are going to take it as a signal about how much they should be saving. There's an economic reason to be saving that amount, but they're going to infer that you put more thought into this than you might have in terms of advice about how much they should be saving. Okay, so I've talked about complexity as a deterrent to good savings outcomes. Complexity leads to procrastination. It leads to the use of simplifying heuristics, and sometimes those heuristics lead individuals to make mistakes, and lead a lot of individuals to make mistakes. And then we've talked about choice architecture as a way to influence savings plan outcomes. I'm just going to go through a quick laundry list of different tools, some of which we've talked about, some of which we haven't, that I think have some relevance in helping to improve participant outcomes in public sector pension plans. So one, we've talked about automatic enrollment. That is the single best way to get people saving in a defined contribution plan. Two, differentiated default options. So think about what is the appropriate default, and the appropriate default may not necessarily be the same for everyone. So if you've got a choice between a defined benefit and a defined contribution or a hybrid plan, you don't need to have the same default for everyone. What would be the best default for different types of employees? You could have a different contribution rate employees for individuals who are not yet vested in the DB plan versus individuals that are. There are lots of ways to think about picking a default that works well. Another example would be Roth versus non-Roth. Whether or not the Roth is the best option probably depends on a whole host of factors. You may have information on that. That's another opportunity. Reduce the number of options, both the number of investment options employees have to choose from, and I know in some of your jurisdictions that might also be reduce the number of plans from which employees have to choose from. Having, 5 dozen supplemental DC plans is doing no one a service. It's making the choice complicated, and you're not getting economies of scale in terms of reducing fees and things like that. Make the choice options comparable. So if you do have to have choices, make it easier for individuals to compare across those choices by making them similar. If you can't use automatic enrollment, require an active choice. So give individuals a deadline and tell them, by December 31st, we need to know, do you want to be in a plan or not? And if you want to be in a plan, which plan? And how much do you want to save? It turns out that this is almost as effective as automatic enrollment if you can implement it well. Use consolidated or simplified approaches to automatic enrollment. So we talked about one simplified approach. If you're a jurisdiction with lots of different plans to choose from, you're going to get more people to sign up if you have a consolidated way, one place where employees can go to pick from those choices rather than they're kind of just all out there in the ether competing for your attention. Next, exploit existing decision moments. So piggyback off of occasions when individuals are already making decisions. So for example, if you have open enrollment for health insurance benefits, that's a great time to try and reach employees to get them to think about whether or not they want to make any changes on the retirement savings side. Exploit fresh start decision moments. So we all screw up. There's some recent interesting literature in psychology suggesting that we allow ourselves to make a fresh start. The best example of this would be the start of a new year in January. So that's an opportunity to get employees to think about what they might be doing differently, but that's not the only one. So other opportunities might be when you're changing a job or when you get a pay raise. So what are the decision moments when you can capture employees' attentions and get them to think about something differently? Reminders. We had an example with the simplified enrollment. Just simply going after people works. Planning aids. Giving people the concrete steps you would need to take to sign up for a plan, to change their contribution rate, to change their asset allocation, breaking it down, how much time, what do you need. This has been shown in some of the literature to actually be very cost effective, low cost, and has a decent impact. And then lastly, for some of these hard choices in intervention, and I'm happy to direct you to some research on this, is to give employees a preference checklist. That is, what are the reasons why this might be a good thing for you, and what are the reasons this might not be a good thing for you? And this, I think, would be particularly relevant in cases where you have choices between a defined benefit, a defined contribution, and a hybrid plan, where you have multiple supplemental plans to choose from, to choose between a Roth and a pre-tax plan. These are all things where there's no single best outcome. What might be good for you might not be good for me, and vice versa. And helping employees, providing an easy way for employees to think through which of these options matches what I need can also be a powerful way to improve outcomes. So I am out of time. I think we've probably got about 10 minutes for questions. Is that right, Keith? But let me just conclude by saying, this is what I do for a living. And if you want to talk more about strategies that you can use to improve outcomes for your employees, I'm happy to talk more with anyone. And there's my email address, and you can also Google me and find me online. And there's your continuing education code, red.
Okay.
Someone snuck that in there. I didn't put that there.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's give her a round of applause. So you can critique me on this, but could I boil it down to simplify, but simplify wisely?
Simplify wisely. I like that. Yeah, yeah.
So we do have some people with microphones. So if anybody has any questions for the professor, they're walking up and down the aisles. And raise your hand so they can see you. One over here, I see. All right, right here? Okay.
Professor Madrian, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Yeah, you talked about sort of the deferral rate, the match rate, and landing at a certain place. You didn't talk as much about auto-escalation. I'm just curious about your views on auto-escalation. Do you land people at a certain spot and stop, or is it better to try to get them to a desired level of savings?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think we don't have a lot of data on what the best approach is. So my own view is that if you can get employees to start saving at a higher rate initially, go for that. But if you have a strong reason to believe that you're going to get resistance, then start lower and auto-escalate. The limited data that we have out there suggests that you can usually get employees up to something like 5 or 6% of pay. So starting at the presumption that you're better off starting at 2 and auto-escalating, I think there's not a lot of data to support that over starting at something like 5 or 6 and auto-escalating. What we don't have a lot of data on is like starting employees out at like 10 or 11 or 12. Now, if you've got a generous defined benefit plan that's also well funded, starting at 10 or 12 might not even be where you want to be. But I think you have to think about how are the employees going to react, and you can also use the match as a way to signal, right? So if you've got a match at 6%, my guess is you can start at 5 or 6%. You can start that high, and you're not going to get pushback relative to starting at, say, 2 or 3%.
Okay, I think I saw somebody up here too, right here in the second row.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Don Kending from Fresno County. One of your earlier slides showed a number of investment choices, and you mentioned to keep them at a minimum, but what is the optimum number? It looked like there was a sweet spot at 29.
Yeah, so I wouldn't put too much weight on the sweet spot at 29 in that figure. In terms of, so why do we have investment options in the plan? It's to give people some flexibility and to allow them to diversify. And the literature on how many investment options you need to get a well-diversified portfolio is like 8 to 10. Like, you don't need more than 10. Once you've got more than 10, you're basically just replicating different ways to get the same diversification, usually at a higher cost. So that's a number of investment options. There's absolutely zero research on what's the right number of plans to choose from. That's not an issue in the private sector, and I'd love to, if there are any of you in jurisdictions with lots of plans and you're thinking about decreasing those and you want to partner with an academic to do research, that's something that I'm definitely interested in. But we don't have a lot of evidence on that other than anecdotal.
Okay, I think we have time for another question or two. Any other questions over here about Midway?
Thank you for your presentation. The question I have regarding simplification and communication to participants against the fiduciary disclosures from a legal perspective, particularly as it relates to investments.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not an attorney. So I'm not quite sure how to exactly answer that. In the simplification study that I referred to earlier, it's interesting, when we did that with what was then Aon Hewitt, their legal team was okay. The full form that employees saw had a little bit more than what I showed you, but it was very straightforward and did not have a lot of legalese. We worked with another organization to do something similar, and their legal department was much more squeamish, and they required a whole bunch of legalese to be put on the form, and it didn't work. That is to say, when they tried sending these out, it didn't have much of an impact, and I think it was because the form was no longer simple because the attorneys got in the way. So I think you kind of have to have a conversation with the legal department. Is there a way to cover your legal bases without throwing the baby out with the bathwater? So can you put it on the back of the form if you're using a form? If you're doing it online, can you have a click through for the terms and conditions without having it all front and center? Like, what are the ways to satisfy the obligations without undermining the larger policy goal, which is to help employees have a good retirement outcome? And my sense is that the attorneys are coming around to this, like people like Cass Sunstein, who's a big, supporter of these types of interventions and also an influential legal scholar, has been having some traction with the legal department or with the legal departments in some organizations. So I think sometimes it's, usually my experience is the legal department is not trying to undermine things. You just have to figure out how to get them on board.
Have you done any research on how many people read the fine print?
Oh yeah. So I had a student who was getting a policy degree and a law degree a few years ago who wrote her master's thesis on that, and the answer is there are lots of interesting examples of like an organization that put in I will give my first child to the devil clause, and nobody noticed it. No court. The good news is no court in the U.S. at least would uphold that. They wouldn't validate that. But yeah, nobody reads those. So if nobody reads them, why give them a lot of real estate space, right?
Right, exactly. Okay, well, thank you again. We really appreciate it.